Hello again, and welcome to my Bonanza Valley and Western workshop. Today I'd like to discuss with you a subject that strikes the fear in the hearts of model railroaders, both young and old, and that's weathering, specifically locomotive weathering. Now I hear you. I was afraid as well. In fact, I came of age in the hobby during the 1980s when the topic of weathering seemed to be just taking hold in the hobby press, and there was a lot of different techniques out there. Myself, the first techniques I learned were taught by Malcolm Furlow, both during his project railroad and model railroader called the San Juan Central, and then in his video titled Weathering Railroad Models with Malcolm Furlow. Now his style was very, very aggressive. Not bad, just aggressive. And if your type of model railroad requires that level of aggressive weathering style, wonderful. I've seen it done to fantastic effect by expert model railroaders in all different scales. A great example of a atmospheric and more aggressive style of weathering is George Cellulose's Franklin and South Manchester. Absolutely beautiful model railroad, and I have no bones to pick with anybody on how they achieve their weathering and to what extent they'll weather a model. But for many of us, the types of model railroading we've chosen to do, prototype modeling or maybe freelance modeling, that extreme aggressive form of weathering doesn't really fit what we're attempting to model. I'm going to do a two-part series here. In part one, I'm going to talk about a key aspect of weathering that you do long before you actually put chalk to model or paint to model or any technique to the model. And that's doing the research. Today, we're so lucky that we have great tools at our disposal. Some of them are old school. As I mentioned earlier, publications like Model Railroader. And here's HO Narrow Gauge Railroad You Can Build by Malcolm Furlow. This is where I learned some of that early aggressive style of techniques that I would never apply today, but at the time, they worked well for me. The Ultimate Guide to Model Railroading, another great hobby publication by Model Railroader that often will have tips and techniques about weathering. If you're a historical society person and your railroad has a historical society affiliated with it, great opportunity to find photographs of locomotives from your period that you're modeling and use those as your guide. Probably the best tool, and I think we can all agree that it's become the hobbyist's best friend, and that's the good old internet, the good old Google, right? I specifically will, if I have a specific locomotive that I'm attempting to weather, I will actually put that locomotive into Google and see what pictures pop up. If I'm lucky, there will be a photograph in the years or the era that I'm attempting to model that can give me a lot of guidance to how I'm going to weather the model. Specific sites like Flickr are a great repository for railroad photographs. Specific sites that maybe if you type in your locomotive, or excuse me, the railroad you're attempting to model, and type in like that railroad plus a roster, there are a lot of sites dedicated to specific prototype rosters, and many of them have great archival photographs of all the locomotives that they had on their roster. One of my favorite sites is railroadpicturesarchives.net. And that's where I found a photograph of a model that I made, that I weathered, of this Elko 415, which the Soo Line referred to as a Dolly sister, along with 416. So I was able to find a photograph of 415 relatively in the time that I was modeling at that time, and I used that as my guide to enhance and get the most effective weathering I could on the model. Now I used a combination of techniques, a little bit of acrylic paint, but mostly chalk. I would encourage you, as you do your research, look at the internet for guidance. There are other aspects of that research that I find to be very handy. Not just the model itself, but also pay close attention to landscape. And if you can see my video screen, you can see sort of the dirt, the atmosphere, sort of the time frame. The Dolly sisters were put out of commission by the Soo Line in the early 80s. But well before that, the Soo Line had made the decision that they were not going to continue to purchase Elco locomotives. So in that sense, these two particular locomotives probably got a little less attention from the Soo Line maintenance department, which ultimately probably impact just how clean they were. So if you're striving to model a very specific time frame, I would keep those two things clearly in mind. What was the status of the locomotive at that time? Was it an Elco in a line that was going to all EMD? And it was only a matter of time before that loco was gone, so the company was not going to invest a lot of time and energy in that particular locomotive. And the landscape. Those are the clues to how dirty or what coloration that you'll ultimately want to apply to your model. Now, Soo Line 415, correct me if I'm wrong, some of you Soo Line followers, but it wasn't serving limestone or quarry or sandy areas. It plied the rails in the last number of years of its life in the Twin Cities, where the dirt was very dark and grimy, where a rust was allowed to build up in certain aspects, and the overall grime of the engine running created a very thick coat of grimy black and downright black areas on the locomotive. So that atmosphere you're trying to create, if I would have applied like a white chalk or something to the trucks that was a little too light in nature, it might have stood out and it might have not fit exactly where that locomotive was on the line. All that's to say is pay close attention to the photographs, not just of the model itself, but to things like the landscape, the dirt, the sand, the atmosphere. Put some thought into thinking about how the corporation might have, or how the company might have treated the locomotive in its final years, such as this Elco locomotive. In this episode, I also want to talk to you about the supplies, because prior to digging into a project, it is really important that you take an evaluation of your supplies and have everything ready to go so it's at your fingertips for when you decide to bite the bullet, swallow your fear, and dig into that locomotive weathering project. Very basically, some of the things I have at my disposal: paper towels, a little container to pour water in, a cup of water, an ample supply of paint brushes and brushes that are specifically dedicated to applying chalks. I have products such as panel line accent color. I got 3 different variations of the panel line. I've got gray, black, and a dark brown. I've got some Vallejo rust stain and streaking paints. These are acrylic based, so they can be wiped off with water. Very important if you're like me and you don't want to commit to using an enamel based paint or an airbrush, but you want techniques that can be wiped away if necessary. So wonderful, wonderful product if you choose to use paints. I tend to prefer chalks, and I've got a variety of chalks that I use. Just a basic set of chalks that I found at a craft store many years ago. I believe I've had these chalks for at least 10 years, and they're hardly even touched. More recently, I've gotten into utilizing weathering powders, which is basically just it's like a chalk product, but it's already been turned into a powder. And I really like Monroe Models weathering powders. I've got grimy black, I've got a rusty brown, and I've got a dark earth. Can of clear coat, flat clear from Tamiya is the type I use. Dull coat also works. You want to have that handy. And I don't have them handy, but the last thing I would say is when you're going to be handling your locomotive, make sure you've got some rubber gloves on. Nothing worse than to put all the effort in, especially using chalks and paints, only to find that you've left some fingerprints in the model. So utilizing a pair of gloves will help minimize any oils or fingerprints that you might leave on the model with bare hands. For part 2, I'm going to weather this B23-7, number 1971 from the Minnesota Commercial. And my computer went dead, but I do have photographs that are key. I've got a photograph of the roof, I've got a photograph of both sides and the trucks, and really gives me a wonderful example so that I don't have to make up or create or imagine how this locomotive would look in the time period that I'm modeling. Now, if you watched my episode on how I selected locomotives for the Bonanza Valley and Western, you'll know that 1971 got scrapped a number of years ago. In fact, the last picture I've found of it online, I believe was from 2020, and it's at a scrapyard in Illinois. So this locomotive, when it was on the Minnesota Commercial, some of the last pictures I have of it are in the late 2014, 2015 timeframe. So I've got a very good representation of how this locomotive looked in its last years on the Minnesota Commercial, as well as how it looked after it was sent down the road to scrap. Now, I model the last number of years, really the last 5 years, so my model will not look like it's going to be scrapped, and it certainly might look a little more used and abused than it was in its heyday on the Minnesota Commercial. I'll say one other thing about locomotives and how they're utilized. Minnesota Commercial, 1971 was purchased or was built in 1979. And if you look at photographs of this locomotive in 2014 and 2015, it looks like it just came from GE. Different railroads had different approaches to how often and how much pride they took in keeping their locomotives clean. In the case of the Minnesota Commercial, they took great pride in keeping their locomotives clean. On my Bonanza Valley and Western, I take a similar approach. My BV&W 2003 really reflects, again, it's a fictitious railroad, but I've utilized the Red River Valley and Western and the Twin Cities and Western as examples of how I should be weathering in the time frame that I'm weathering or that I'm modeling. And this is a good example. I very lightly weathered this because the Bonanza Valley and Western takes great pride in its locomotives. And I will probably take a very similar approach with 1971. That's been plying the rails of the Bonanza Valley and Western for a couple of years now. But we're very proud of this locomotive, and we're going to want to weather it just lightly and make it look like it's a real active member of our roster here on our freelance model railroad. So that's what I have for you for part 1. Again, an important part of weathering your models and overcoming that trepidation you have about getting into weathering is just flat out doing some research. Take your time. Look up the locomotives you have on your roster that aren't weathered, or maybe you've never weathered at all, and do some evaluation of those locomotives online. And understand that the pictures you're looking at are only that, they're pictures. Notice things like rust, notice things like grease and grime and dust and dirt. And for right now, just take those things in. Don't worry about the other stuff until you're good and ready. And on that note, I'm going to say goodbye and keep your eye open for part 2, when I'll actually dig into applying some of the different products to 1971 and show you how I overcame my fear of weathering model railroad locomotives. Until next time, take care.